Welcome to the 1000 Nights and 1 Night. Now, when it was the 357th night, she said, "It hath reached me, O auspicious king, that the young man continued, in truth, Allah had done away from her this appetite, whereat I marveled and acquainted her with the case. Thereupon I lived with her, and she took the old woman to be her in the stead of her mother, and said to who told me the tale, the old woman and the young man and his wife abode in joy and cheer till they came to the destroyer of delights and the sunderer of societies. And glory be to the ever-living one, who dieth not in his hand, is dominion of the world, visible and invisible." Now, another tale they tell is that of the Ebony Horse. There once was in times of yore, and ages long gone before, a great and puissant king, of the kings of the Persians, Sabur by name, who was the richest of all the kings in store of wealth and dominion, and surpassed each and every in wit and wisdom. He was generous, open-handed, and beneficent, and he gave to those who sought him, and repelled not those who resorted to him. And he comforted the broken-hearted, and honorably entreated those who fled to him in refuge. Moreover, he loved the poor, and was hospitable to strangers, and did the oppressed justice upon the oppressor. He had 3 daughters, like full moons of shining light, of flower gardens blooming bright, and a son, as he were the moon. And it was his wont to keep 2 festivals in the 12th month, those of Nawraz, or New Year, and Murgan, the autumnal equinox, on which occasions he threw open his palaces, and gave largesse, and made proclamation of safety and security, and promoted his chamberlains and viceroys, and the people of his realm came to him, and saluted him, and gave him joy of the holy day, bringing him gifts and servants and eunuchs. Now he loved science and geometry, and one festival day, as he sat on his kingly throne, there came to him 3 wise men, cunning artificers and past masters in all manner of craft and inventions, skilled in making things curious and rare, such as confounded the wit, and versed in the knowledge of occult truths, and perfect in mysteries and subtleties. And there were of the 3 different tongues and countries, the first a Hindu or Indian, the second a Romani or Greek, and the third a Farsi or Persian. The Indian came forwards, and prostrating himself before the king, wished him joy of the festival, and laid before him a present befitting his dignity, that is to say, a man of gold set with precious gems and jewels of price, and handing in hand a golden trumpet. When Sabur saw this, he asked, "O sage, what is the virtue of this figure?" And the Indian answered, "O my lord, if this figure be set at the gate of thy city, it will be guardian over it. For if an enemy enter the place, it will blow this clarion against him, and he will be seized with a palsy and drop down dead." Much the king marveled at this, and cried, "By Allah, O sage, and this thy word be true, I will grant thee thy wish and thy desire." Then came forward the Greek, and prostrating himself before the king, presented him with a basin of silver, in whose midst was a peacock of gold, surrounded by 24 chicks of the same metal. Sabur looked at them, and turning to the Greek, said to him, "O sage, what is the virtue of this peacock?" "O my lord," answered he, "as often as an hour of the day or night pass, it pecketh one of its young, and crieth out, and flappeth its wings, till the 20 hours are accomplished. And when the month cometh to an end, it will open its mouth, and thou shalt see the crescent therein." And the king said, "And thou speak sooth, I will bring thee to thy wish and thy desire." Then came forward the Persian sage, and prostrating himself before the king, brought before him a horse of the blackest ebony wood, inlaid with gold and jewels, and ready harnessed with saddle, bridle, and stirrup, such as befit kings. And when Sabur saw it, He marveled with exceeding marvel, and was confounded at the beauty of its form and the integrity of its fashion. So he asked, "What is the use of the horse of wood, and what is its virtue, and what secret of its movement?" And the Persian answered, "O my lord, the virtue of this horse is that if one mount him, he will carry him whither he will and fare with its rider through the air and cover the space of a year in a single day." The king marveled with and was amazed at these three wonders, following thus hard upon one another of the same day, and turning to the sage said to him, "By Allah the Omnipotent and the Lord of the Beneficent, who created all creatures and feedeth them with meat and drink, and thy speech be veritable, and the virtue of thy contrivance appear, I will assuredly give thee whatsoever thou lustest for, and will bring thee to thy desire and thy wish." Then he entertained the sages 3 days, that he might make trial of their gifts, after which they brought the figures before him, and each took the creature he had wrought, and showed him the mysteries of its movement. The trumpeter blew the trump, the peacock pecked its chicks, and the Persian sage mounted the ebony horse, whereupon it soared with him high in the air and descended again. Now, when King Sabur saw all this, he was amazed and perplexed, and felt like to fly for joy, and said to the 3 sages, "Now I am certified of the truth of your words, and it behoveth me to quit me of my promise. Ask ye, therefore, what ye will, and I will give you the same." Now the report of the king's daughters had reached the sages, so they answered, "If the king be content with us, and accept of our gifts, and allow us to prefer a request to him, we crave of him that he give us his 3 daughters in marriage, that we may be his son-in-laws, for that the stability of kings may not be gainsaid." Quoth the king, "I grant you that which you wish and you desire," and bade summon the Kazee forthright, that he might marry each of the sages to one of his daughters. Now it fortuned that the princesses were behind the curtain and looking on, and when they heard this, the youngest considered her husband to be, and behold, he was an old man, 100 years of age, with hair frosted, forehead drooping, eyebrows mangy, ears slitten, beard and mustachios stained with dye, eyes red and google, cheeks bleached and hollow, flabby nose like a brinjal or an eggplant, face like a cobbler's apron, teeth overlapping, and lips like camel's kidneys, loose and pendulous. In brief, a terror, a horror, a monster, for he was of the folk of his time, the unsightliest of his age, the frightliest. Sundry of his grinders had been knocked out, and his eye teeth were like the tusk of the jinni who frightened poultry in hen houses. Now the girl was the fairest and the most graceful of her time, more elegant than the gazelle, however tender, than the gentlest zephyr, blander and brighter than the moon at her full, for amorous fray right suitable, confounding in graceful sway, the waving bow and the outdoing and swimming gait, the pacing row. In finer, she was fairer and sweeter by far than all her sisters. So when she saw her suitor, she went to her chamber, and strewed dust on her head, and tore her clothes, and fell to buffeting her face, and weeping and wailing. Now the prince, her brother Kamar al-Akmar, or the Moon of Moons, Hit, was then newly returned from a journey, and hearing her weeping and crying, came to her, for he loved her with fond affection more than his other sisters. And he asked her, "What aileth thee? What hath befallen thee? Tell me, and conceal not from me." So she smote her breast and answered, "O my brother and my dear one, I have nothing to hide. If the palace be straitened upon thy father, I will go out, and if he be resolved upon a foul thing, I will separate myself from him, though he consent not to make provision for me, and my lord will provide." Quoth he, "Tell me what meaneth this talk, and what hath straitened thy breast and troubled thy temper?" "O my brother and my dear one," answered the princess, "know that my father hath promised me in marriage to a wicked magician, who bought him as a gift a horse of black wood, and hath bewitched him with his craft and his necromancy. But as for me, I will none of him, and would because of him I had never come into this world." Her brothers soothed her and solaced her, then fared to his sire and said, What be this wizard to whom thou hast given my sister in marriage, and what is this present which he hath brought thee, so that thou hast killed my sister with chagrin? It is not right that this should be. Now the Persian was standing by, and when he heard the prince's words, he was mortified and filled with fury, and the king said, O my son, and thou sawest this horse, thy wit would be confounded, and thou wouldst be amazed with amazement. Then he bade the slaves bring the horse before him, and they did so. And when the prince saw it, it pleased him. So being an accomplished cavalier, he mounted it forthright, and struck its sides with the shovel-shaped stirrup irons, but it moved not. And the king said to the sage, Go show him its movements, that he may help thee to win thy wish. Now the Persian bore the prince a grudge, because he willed not that he should have his sister. So he showed him the pin of ascent on the right side of the horse, and saying to him, Trill this, left him. Thereupon the prince trilled the pin, and lo, the horse forthwith soared with high in ether, as it were a bird, and gave not over flying till it disappeared from men's espying. Whereat the king was troubled and perplexed about his case, and said to the Persian, O sage, look how thou mayest make him descend. But he replied, O my lord, I can do nothing, and thou wilt never see him again till resurrection day, for he of his ignorance and prize asked me not of the pin of descent, and I forgot to acquaint him thereof. When the king heard this, he was enraged with a sore raise, and bade Bastina the sorcerer and clap him in jail, while he himself cast the crown from his head, and beat his face, and smote his breast. Moreover, he shut the doors of his palace, and gave himself up to weeping and keening, he, his wife, his daughters, and all the folk of the city. And thus their joy was turned to annoy, and their gladness changed into sore affliction and sadness. Thus far concerning them, but as regards the prince, the horse gave not over soaring with him till he drew him near the sun, whereat he gave himself up for lost, and saw death in the skies, and was confounded at his case, repenting him of having mounted the horse, and saying to himself, Verily, this was the device of the sage to destroy me on account of my youngest sister. But there is no majesty, and there is no might, save in Allah, the glorious, the great. I am lost without recourse. But I wonder, did not he who made the ascent pin make also a descent pin? Now, he was a man of knowledge and intelligence, so he fell to feeling all the parts of the horse, but saw nothing save a screw like a cock's head on its right shoulder, and the like on the left, when quoth he himself, I see no sign save these things like buttons. Presently he turned the right-hand pin, whereupon the horse flew heavenwards with increased speed. So he left it, and looking at the sinister shoulder, and finding another pin, he wound it up, and immediately the steed's upward motion slowed and ceased, and it began to descend, little by little, towards the face of the earth, while the rider became yet more cautious and careful of his life. And Scheherazade perceived the dawn of the day, and ceased to say her permitted say. Now, when it was the 358th night, she said, It hath reached me, O auspicious king, that when the prince wound up the sinister screw, the steed's upward motion slowed and ceased, and it began to descend little by little towards the earth, while the rider became yet more cautious and careful of his life. And when he saw this and knew the uses of the horse, his heart was filled with joy and gladness, and he thanked Almighty Allah for that he had deigned delivery of him from destruction. Then he began to turn the horse's head whithersoever he would, making it rise and fall at pleasure, till he had gotten complete mastery over every movement. He ceased not to descend the whole of that day, for that steed's ascending flight had borne him afar from the earth. And as he descended, he diverted himself with viewing the various cities and countries over which he passed, which he knew not, never having seen them in his life. Amongst the rest, he descried a city ordered after the fairest fashion in the midst of a verdant and riant land, rich in trees and streams, with gazelles pacing daintily over the plains. Whereat he fell amusing and said to himself, "What I knew the name of yon town, and of what land it is." And he took to circling about it and observing right and left. By this time the day began to decline, and the sun drew near its downing. He said in his mind, "Verily I find no goodlier place to night than in this city. So I will lodge here, and early in the morning I will return to my kith and kin and my kingdom, and tell my father and family what hath passed, and acquaint him with what mine eyes have seen." Then he addressed himself to seeking a place wherein he might safely bestow himself and his horse, and where none should decry him. And presently, behold, he espied a middlemost of the city, a palace rising high in upper air, surrounded by great wall with lofty crenelles and battlements, guarded by 40 black slaves clad in complete mail, and armed with spears and swords and bows and arrows. Quoth he, "This is a goodly place," and turned the descent pin, whereupon the horse sank down with him like a weary bird, and alighted gently on the terrace roof and of the palace. So the prince dismounted, and ejaculating, "Alhamdulillah, praised be it to Allah," and he began to go round about the horse and examine it, saying, "By Allah, he who fashioned these with perfections was a cunning craftsman. And if the Almighty extend the term of my life, and restore me to my country and kinsfolk in safety, and reunite me with my father, I will assuredly bestow upon him all manner bounties, and benefit him with the utmost beneficence." By this time night had overtaken him, and he sat on the roof till he was assured that all in the palace slept. And indeed hunger and thirst were sore upon him, for he had not tasted food nor drunk water since he parted from his sire. So he said to himself, "Surely the like of this palace will not lack of victuals," and leaving the horse above, went down in search of somewhat to eat. Presently he came to a staircase, and descending it to the bottom, found himself in the court, paved with white marble and alabaster, which shone in the light of the moon, and he marveled at the place and the goodliness of its fashion, but sensed no sound of speaker, and saw no living soul, and stood in perplexed surprise, looking right and left, and knowing not whither he should wend. Then he said to himself, "I may not do better than return to where I left my horse, and pass the night by it, and as soon as day shall dawn I will mount and ride away." And Shahrazad perceived the dawn of the day, and ceased saying her permitted say. Now, when it was 359th night, she said, "It hath reached me, O auspicious king, that," quoth the king's son to himself, "I may not do better than pass the night by my horse, and as soon as day shall dawn I shall mount and ride away." However, as he tarried talking to himself, he espied a light within the palace, and making towards it found that it came from a candle that stood before a door of the harem, as the head of a sleeping eunuch, as it were one of the Ifrits of Solomon, or a tribesman of the Jinn, longer than lumber and broader than a bench. He lay before the door with the pommel of his sword gleaming in the flame of the candle, and at his head was a bag of leather hanging from a column of granite. When the prince saw this, he was affrighted, and said, "I crave help from Allah the Supreme, O mine Holy One, even as thou hast already delivered me from destruction, so vouchsafe me strength to quit myself of this adventure of this palace." So saying, he put out his hand to the budget, and taking it, carried it aside, and opened it, and found in it food of the best. He ate his fill, and refreshed himself, and drank water, after which he hung up the provision bag in its place, and drawing the eunuch's sword from its sheath, took it while the slave slept, knowing not whence destiny should come to him. Then the prince fared forwards into the palace, and ceased not till he came to a second door with a curtain drawn before it. So he raised the curtain, and behold, on entering he saw a couch of the whitest ivory, inlaid with pearls and jacinths and jewels, and 4 slave girls sleeping about it. He went up to the couch to see what was thereon, and found a young lady lying asleep, chemised with her hair, as it were the full moon rising over the eastern horizon, with flower-white brow and shining hair parting, and cheeks like blood-red anemones, and dainty moles thereon. He was amazed at her as she lay in her beauty and loveliness, her symmetry and grace, and he recked no more of death. So he went up to her, trembling in every nerve, and shuddering with pleasure, kissed her on the right cheek, whereupon she awoke affright, and opened her eyes, and seeing the prince standing at her head, said to him, Who art thou, and whence comest thou? Quoth he, I am thy slave, and thy lover. Asked she, And who brought thee hither? And he answered, My lord and my fortune. Then said Shams al-Nahar, for such was her name, Happily thou art he who demanded me yesterday my father in marriage, and he rejected thee, pretending that thou wast foul of favor. By Allah, my sire lied in his throat when he spoke this thing, for thou art not other than beautiful. Now the son of the king of Hind had sought her in marriage, but her father had rejected him, for he was ugly and uncouth, and she thought the prince was he. So when she saw his beauty and grace, for indeed he was like the radiant moon, the synthesis of love got hold of her heart, as it were a flaming fire, and they fell to talk and converse. Suddenly her waiting woman awoke, and seeing the prince with her mistress, asked her, O my lady, who is this with thee? Quoth she, I know not. I found him sitting by me when I woke up. Happily 'tis he who seek me in marriage of my sire. Quoth they, O my lady, by Allah the All-Father, this is not he who seeketh thee in marriage, for he is hideous, and this man is handsome and of high degree. Indeed, the other is not fit to be his servant. Then the handmaidens went out to the eunuch, and finding him slumbering, awoke him, and started up in alarm. Said they, How happeth that thou art on guard at the palace, and yet men came in to us whilst we slept? When the black heard this, he sprang in haste to his sword, but found it not, and fear took him, and trembling. Then he went in, and confounded to his mistress, and seeing the prince sitting at talk with him, and said to him, O my lord, art thou man or jinni? Replied the prince, Woe to thee, O unluckiest of slaves! How darest thou even the sons of the royal Kalros with one of the unbelieving Satans? And he was a raging lion. Then he took the sword in his hand, and said to the slave, I am the king's son-in-law, and he hath married me to this daughter, and bidden me to go into her. And when the eunuch heard these words, he replied, O my lord, if thou be indeed the kind of a man as thou avouchest, she is fit for none but thee, and thou art worthier of her than any other. Thereupon the eunuch ran to the king, shrieking loud and rending his raiment, and heaving dust upon his head. And when the king heard his outcry, he said to him, What hath befallen thee? Speak quickly and be brief, for thou hast fluttered my heart. Answered the eunuch, O king, come to thy daughter's succor, for a devil of the jinn is the likeliest of a king's son hath gotten possession of her, so up and at him. When the king heard this, he thought to kill him, and said, How camest thou to be careless of my daughter, and let this demon come to her? Then he betook himself to the princess's palace, where he found her slave women standing to await him, and asked, What is come to my daughter? O king, answered they, slumber overcame us, and when we awoke, we found a young man sitting here upon the couch, in talk with her, as if he were the full moon. Never saw we aught fairer or fairer than he. So we questioned him of his case, and he declared that thou hast given him thy daughter in marriage. More than this we know not, nor do we know if he be a man or a jinni. But he is modest, well-bred, and doth nothing unseemly or which leadeth to disgrace. Now, when the king heard these words, his wrath cooled, and he raised the curtain little by little, and looking in, saw sitting at talk with his daughter a prince of the goodliest, with face like the full moon for sheen. At the sight he could not contain himself of his jealousy for his daughter's honor, and putting aside the curtain, rushed in upon them, drawn sword in hand, like a furious ghoul. Now, when the prince saw him, he asked the princess, Is this thy sire? And she answered, Yes. And Shahrazad perceived the dawn of the day, and ceased to say her permitted say. And so do I cease my tale for the day, till it be morrow.